Welcome, Bob Burns, candidate for Congress in the 2nd New Hampshire District. Good to have you here. I want to kind of just jump in. When you won your primary race, I think you told Rick Green, our political reporter, that one of the things that really drove that is being the only candidate who had really embraced Donald Trump, had his endorsement. You worked on his campaign in 2016. And so that's certainly a part of your political identity right now.
Yeah, sure. But I do want to correct you on one thing. I never actually got his endorsement. When
I'm
spoke
sorry.
to him,
I'm sorry.
When I spoke to him, he said I didn't get his endorsement because they were really pushing the other guy very hard and told him that I had no chance of winning. So I guess George's people were really trying to work Trump over, but he wasn't going to endorse him. But I guess he was really trying hard to get that endorsement.
Well, that sounds like something that typically he'd be like, well, I'm not going to listen to them, but fair enough. So, but you definitely have stood by him.
Yes.
So I want to start with that aspect of your candidacy. So do you believe that the January 6th events at the Capitol were an assault on American democracy?
So first off, you've got to separate the events. I mean, Trump had a rally, miles away, and a lot of people try to conflate the two as being the same event, and it's not. What we had a lot of people there that went and caused a lot of destruction and committed crimes at the Capitol building. But you also have a lot of Americans that have been unjustly investigated, their phone records, their bank accounts subpoenaed, who were never near the Capitol building. Now, when you're talking about an assault on the Constitution and everything our country stands for, when I look at politicians going after people they know were 100% innocent, nowhere near the Capitol building, and are being unjustly investigated, that's my greatest concern. And that's the biggest assault on democracy I've seen from that day.
Okay, so, but do you think that the government should fervently pursue those who were responsible?
They fervently pursued people who were no near the Capitol building. That's a complete and entire injustice. That's against the Constitution. I mean, that's unreasonable search and seizure. That's what happened, and that's what's been happening. That's crazy for politicians, law enforcement agencies to be doing something like that. I don't care about some crazy guy in horns that wants to make a name for himself on YouTube, who was never a Republican to begin with. He didn't care about anything that day except getting attention for himself. I care about politicians making a conscious effort to go out there and investigate people that they know were nowhere near the Capitol building, went out there and illegally collected data on them, subpoenaed their bank records, subpoenaed their phone records. That's my greatest concern. I mean, you should be concerned about that. I mean, unreasonable search and seizure is something that we should all be concerned about, especially when it's done by our government.
Well, I don't
Would you not agree with that?
I would agree with the idea that you're expressing, but I don't know the specifics of how involved the attack on the Capitol was, and
listen, if somebody wasn't even close to it,
so,
why would they have their bank records subpoenaed? I mean, honestly, and the government knows that they were nowhere near.
Okay, so
I mean, if you can explain that to me, then I think we can have a conversation. But if you don't really know what happened there and how people are being unfairly persecuted, then I don't know what we're discussing then.
Well, I think that I would tend to give law enforcement the ability to pursue if they think that
So with no
That
probable cause, you
event
believe that
was,
law
I don't
enforcement
know
should,
if there was probable
there was no
cause,
probable
because
cause.
I'm not privy to those, to that information.
Mm.
I'm not in law enforcement.
Let me ask you a question. I mean, do you believe that law enforcement has ever gone after people for political reasons with no probable cause in the past?
Ever? Probably.
Yes. Probably?
Yeah.
So rather than be argumentative about
Wouldn't
this,
you say definitely?
Mr. Burns, I just want to clarify. So if there have been bank records sought and phone records sought and the like, and the like, there would have had to have been a judge that would have had to sign off on a search warrant. Are you suggesting the judges are complicit in that as well?
I believe actually Congress just did it without a judge, actually, is my understanding, that they had the ability to investigate and subpoena those without a judge being involved.
Well, that's true about Congress, but you were talking about law
No,
enforcement.
I'm talking about Congress and the people from J6. I mean, yes, we know in the past judges, let's say during the 1960s civil rights movement, judges absolutely went in there and said that they had probable cause to go after civil rights leaders. I mean, would you agree that that was okay for them to do? I know I'm flipping this around on you, but I mean, you get what I'm saying here, and we're really going off on a bit of a tangent. Listen, people in New Hampshire want to start talking about the economy, energy, electricity, and you guys want to talk about January 6th and a guy who was wearing horns. Put the guy in jail. He's an idiot. I don't care. But there's a lot of people who are unfairly investigated from that day. That absolutely happened. And that's my greater concern. That's really all I can say about that.
Okay, well, let's set aside that day. Do you believe Donald Trump when he says he won the 2020 election?
You know, I've answered this question about 25 times, so I think that you can find every statement that I've ever made on this. What I'd like people to ask Custer is, does she believe John Kerry won the 2000 election and the 2004 election from Ohio? Why did in 2010 over 50% of Democrats say that 9/11 was an inside job? Why do many Democrats still believe that the Georgia gubernatorial election was stolen?
I'm sorry,
I've said 25. I've given the answer on this 25 times that I do not believe that he won, but I believe that there are a lot of discrepancies, and I do believe that a lot of people have illegally voted, and I believe that we have a lot of problems in our voting system. And I think Democrats agree with me, because Democrats have said that the 2000 election was stolen, the 2004, the 2016 by a few $1,000s from Russia. So clearly the Democrats and I agree that we have a lot of problems with voting.
So you've answered the question, so maybe we should move on.
Okay, so let's bring this closer to your experience.
Sure.
So you were a ward selectman in Manchester for some time. So what, if anything, did you see while doing that would lead you to think that elections in New Hampshire are not secure?
Well, the first time I ran for executive council in 2012, I ended up picking up close to 80 votes from one singular ward because of bad counting. So I've seen it. That's a huge amount of votes from one single ward in Manchester.
Okay, so that would be an error.
Sometimes we have untrained people that don't really know what they're doing. We have old, antiquated machines that do create problems with the vote, as we saw in Salem. And then we should be auditing them periodically, absolutely, to make sure that the machines are working. And there's a lot of different ways statistically that we can find irregularities and actually find these problems almost instantaneously. And we're not doing that. I have a statistics background. When we saw the irregularity with the amount of overvotes in my ward, it wasn't in my ward, it was a different ward in Manchester in 2012 when I ran for executive council. Honestly, a computer should have instantaneously caught exactly what happened. Now I was at the Secretary of State's office. I knew exactly what happened. I explained it to the Secretary of State. He couldn't quite understand it. But what had happened is a brand new moderator had come in and double counted votes. So there was a write-in for state rep. And so when all those state rep votes got set to the side, it counts all of the votes except for the one column where there were the write-ins. But then they ended up double counting all those votes in that ward. Now, it wasn't nefarious, but when you've got, quite frankly, close elections for state rep, senator, et cetera, When you see a 50, 60, vote margin difference in one singular ward, that's an issue. And we need to have safeguards in place to make sure that things like that don't happen, because we have such a narrow time period between the primary and the general election that a lot of times people don't call for, recounts because they never expect to see that many votes change. But I saw that many votes change in my first major race. And that's an issue. And we need to make sure that we don't see issues like that. But I'm going to tell you, you can write algorithms that can actually pick up a lot of these issues.
Okay. So on your website, you say you have experience in local government, county government, and you own your own business, and that gives you, or would give you, a unique perspective in Congress, in Washington. But those are really pretty common things for somebody running for Congress to have owned their own business.
There's nobody with my level of experience when it comes to pharmaceutical manufacturing and the bureaucracy at the FDA.
Well, that's what I wanted to get at.
Okay.
if you when you put it that broadly as I own my own business, was in local government, that's pretty common for somebody as a candidate. So I wanted to get at what really it makes your perspective different. What sets you apart as a candidate?
So really it's what I do in my experience dealing with regulation and the FDA, and having a real unique perspective, particularly when it comes to quality control and why so much of our pharmaceuticals has been moving overseas. Now, listen, in a Republican primary, saying that you work in the pharmaceutical industry hasn't gone over so well since COVID. But, it is, I still believe, and I do this all the time. I get into a room, raise your hands if you don't take a pharmaceutical like a statin, a blood pressure medication, whatever, birth control, what have you. I mean, that's all the drug industries that I'm working in. So I specifically work with quality control equipment, but we also work in implementing and validating and putting that equipment in. Now, one of the biggest problems here in the United States, somebody might buy a $50,000 piece of equipment and then spend 3 years and $2 million implementing that piece of equipment. If I were to sell that piece of equipment to China, it would be in the field working the next day without all of that overregulation. And when I say overregulation, I mean, we sit there and we continuously create documentation and paperwork that nobody's ever going to read again. And it really doesn't add anything to the value of the pharmaceutical that, as I see it, it helps to create a lot of companies who make a lot of money creating more regulations. And many of these companies are run by former FDA agents. And I find that extremely problematic. And that's really what hampers production here in the United States. And there's really nobody with that sort of level of experience, especially when it comes to this industry. Now, let's also talk about the vaccines. There's very few people with as much knowledge about what happened to the vaccines and why they were delayed as much as I did. Now, Moderna actually had their vaccine ready to go before Pfizer and before the elections. Now, I can't give you the specific reason of why it was delayed and stopped, but the reason that the FDA gave is because there wasn't enough minorities in the study. Now, 20 years ago, we never did studies based on race. It was actually considered unethical back then. Then, of course, we found out, in fact, different races do respond to different medications differently, which is fine, and it's totally valid. But Pfizer was never held to the same standard as Moderna was. And Moderna was ready to go months before Pfizer. Now, you can Google this. There's actually articles out there about this. They kind of allude to it a little bit. They're not so specific on exactly what happened, but they say that the research studies were slowed down to find more minorities. And I really think that put a lot of people's lives at risk. And I feel like it's something that needs to be investigated. I'm not just going to run out there and say, jail Fauci. Please don't take that out of context, anybody, without bringing up specific reasons why I think that there was some problems. And one of the biggest problems is, you may know this, the former FDA director, right before COVID, Scott Gottlieb, and quite frankly, who was appointed by Trump, went to go work for Pfizer almost immediately. And then he became one of the biggest salesmen, quite frankly, as far as I'm concerned, for Pfizer when I would watch TV. And I just have a real problem with somebody going from FDA director to then working on the board of directors or whatever of Pfizer to go out there and sell their products. And I really do want to investigate, how this relationship happened, why the Moderna vaccine was kept back, and why the Pfizer vaccine had to be the first one put out there, even though it was legitimately done later. and wasn't held to the same standards as Moderna was. I know that's a lot to take in.
That's fine. That's your background. So you also say that you want to look at legislation as a member of Congress to see if it's constitutional, cost-effective, and necessary to the necessary function of the federal government. So that kind of begs the question: what functions of federal government are necessary and what aren't?
Well, I mean, quite frankly, the Department of Education. Taxing people is necessary, but having the IRS is not necessary. States can actually come up and tax and then pay the federal government themselves, just as say I did as, so I don't do that as county treasurer. So, when we talk about having like a flat or a fair tax, you wouldn't necessarily need the IRS. And we definitely don't need 87,000 armed IRS agents. That kind of terrifies me. Even when Obama first got in office in 2008, he actually said he was receptive to the fair tax. But then, of course, once he got to DC, into the DC swamp and machine, he totally went back on that. And then, of course, weaponized the IRS. So I don't believe that we need the IRS. We can do a flat tax or a fair tax that's collected at the state, then the state sends the money to the federal government. And that gets rid of a huge bureaucratic arm of the government. And then, quite frankly, I also believe that all education should be local. I think the states can handle that themselves without a federal oversight that we've seen. I believe New Hampshire can take care of education on its own.
Hi, Bob. How you doing?
Good.
Let me ask you some questions now.
Sure.
Inflation's on everyone's mind and is one of your core issues. What specific steps would you, as one member of Congress, take to reduce prices? And what steps would you take to reduce the federal deficit?
So I think that reducing prices, there's no quick fix. I wish there was. Obviously, a lot of inflation ties in with energy costs, gasoline, shipping. We need an all-above approach. I wouldn't have shut down the XL pipeline. I believe that we need to reopen that. Canada wants it reopened. They're our number one ally. They were not happy about when we closed that down. So we can start to reduce some of that energy costs and some of that inflation right off the bat. Obviously, one of the things that would help with inflation and reducing our deficit would be all of these programs, these boondoggle programs that we're continuously creating, including, talking about the bailouts for the student loan programs. The PPP, I understand it. I believe that, we might have had some reason to do it, but I think it was rolled out way too fast. We saw a lot of corruption in there. We saw a lot of companies that didn't exist that got millions of dollars. And then we heard about some of the people that we caught, buying Lamborghinis, and sports cars and boats and houses. And, they had 12 fake companies collecting. And a lot of that money's gone overseas and we're never going to collect it. We're never going to see it again. So we have to work on the corruption side as well. We have to work on a lot of this payout. I think there's also a lot we can do towards healthcare. I want kind of a universal basic preventative maintenance plan out there that everybody can afford. I don't believe in giving anything away for free, because if it's free, then people don't see value in it. But even if it's $5 to go in there and get a cancer screening, but by increasing the amount of cancer screenings we have, increasing efficiency of the way that we do it and deliver that, we can lower those costs. And I think that's very important. And by catching, obviously, a lot of these disease and cancers and stuff early on should reduce healthcare costs as well. And I mean, healthcare costs are huge in this country. I mean, that's a lot what we're paying towards. And we need to really work on lowering those costs. And we have to stop using healthcare as a political football and come up with real solutions.
Would that be implemented at the federal level?
Yeah, I think so. So instead of going through like the Medicaid on the state level, because unfortunately, if we tried to push it on the state level, I just don't think it would work out, and then giving the money to the states. So I would like something more on a federal level where we came up with basic contracts. I mean, maybe there would be money then given to some of these local, quick healthcare providers, especially for certain tests like pap smears, mammograms, testicular cancer screenings. But I want people to go in there and get those screenings. I want it to be a universal, a basic low charge that everybody has access to. And the way to encourage people is one of the things we've always seen. You give something away for totally free, people don't see any value in it. You give something and it's $5, people actually do see more value in it. But we need to encourage people to get those screenings to catch these disease early. And I think this would actually help to lower healthcare costs quite a bit. And there's a lot of other things that I think that we can do in healthcare. I want the ability to see the real pricing. So for example, you want to go out and get a hip replacement. We should be able to go onto the internet and say, hey, if I go to this hospital, one town over on a Wednesday, it would cost half as much as staying at, this hospital within my city on a Friday. And I think people should know that. And that's another way to start, reducing healthcare costs and alleviating hospitals during their busy times.
Mm-hmm. Manufacturing is another big issue. You say we need to bring more of it back to America. What's your plan for that?
So the manufacturing that I want to bring back specifically is critical manufacturing. I have no delusions that we're not going to bring back most textiles, shirts, things like that. But I think it's important for national security that we do produce things like chips and pharmaceuticals here. The federal government is the largest buyer of pharmaceuticals. And if they were just to mandate that those pharmaceuticals are made in the United States, they would come back. And again, the huge cost with production here, because of course, the majority of the cost when it comes to pharmaceuticals is research and development. That's going to cost the same no matter what. Production really isn't labor intensive. So the reason that they left wasn't because of labor, it's because of the regulations. So for example, if a pharmaceutical facility is in, let's say, India or China, the FDA can't just show up and inspect the plant, but they can in the United States, and they do all the time, particularly if it's like a manufacturing facility in a place like Puerto Rico, where everybody wants to go for the weekend. And that's unfortunately, but it actually is true that we've found testimony from FDA agents that just said, well, I don't want to go to Mumbai, India. I got sick the last time I was there. I want to go to Puerto Rico. And this has cost a lot of strain on American manufacturers. So at one point, we were making about 70% of our products in Puerto Rico. Now it's probably less than 20.
Energy is another topic that's been in the news a lot lately. What are your thoughts on our energy policy, where it is and where it should go?
So we need to be pushing more traveling wave nuclear power. So this is brand new power, nuclear power. This isn't your father's nuclear power. It's safer, it's cheaper, and it's going to be cleaner. It actually uses nuclear waste a lot of the time. So we've got one company working on this, and this is problematic. It's entirely owned by Bill Gates. It's called TerraPower. They are on the verge of opening up. I believe they're going to open up their first plant in 2027, which is exciting. It really is. And I'm glad for what he's doing, but we need to see more competition in the marketplace. And if it's because of regulation that's keeping competition out, we need to work on that to make sure that we have competition and he's not the only game in town. The other thing that he's doing that's very interesting that they're going to be looking at is nuclear shipping. So instead of burning diesel and diesel, moving these boats, large ships across the world, we'll have clean, renewable energy. And that's really exciting.
That is interesting. Of course, the subject of abortion has been, foremost in a lot of campaigns this cycle. If I'm not mistaken, you've said you support a federal fetal heartbeat abortion ban. The Supreme Court ruling kind of left the whole issue in the lap of the states. Why would you want to take that away from the states and impose kind of a one-size-fits-all federal prescription for that?
So, listen, if it's in the states and the federal government and the Supreme Court, it's going to overturn it, then there's really nothing that I, as a congressman, I can do one way or the other. Now, the Democrats have tried to push federal legislation after Roe v. Wade, 24 weeks, or what they call codifying Roe v. Wade. So right now, the Democrats' point of view is that they're going to push federal legislation on abortion. Now, I've come out for abortion with restrictions, which 70% or something of Americans agree with. And it's not a ban. I mean, it's like anything, guns, alcohol, all have restrictions. I wouldn't say that we have a gun ban. Now, it's very difficult for me to buy a fully automatic weapon, but I'm not banned from doing it. It has a lot of restrictions on it. It would be the same thing to say whether we have an alcohol ban. We don't have an alcohol ban, but I can't buy after 11:15. What the Democrats want and what Custer wants is extremely radical and very few Americans agree with. 40 weeks, no restrictions, and paid for by the federal government. But from your point, I mean, it sounds like it's probably a moot point, at least in the immediate future, because it is going to be a state issue, apparently.
Well, the restrictions you speak of, the fetal heartbeat it'd be like a 6 to 7 week restriction.
12 weeks,
actually.
The 12 weeks is when you can actually identify it. People do say that there's a fetal heartbeat before that, but I believe it's called the Doppler machine that they use sees it at 12. Lindsey Graham has a 15-week one. You know, the 15-week one, I'm willing to be out there and compromise if that's what it comes down to. But I mean, that's in line with the rest of the world, essentially. I mean, as you know, the vast majority of the world, particularly places like Africa and South America, have essentially abortion bans. That's the most of the world. Then most of Europe is more in line with 15 weeks, like France, Germany, and Spain. So, you know, we're very extreme here in the United States with this 40 weeks. Like no other country. There's a few, I believe like Canada and New Zealand, but it's very few countries that have that level, and very few Americans agree with that.
Okay. Turning from abortion to China, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, sure.
You
said China like Trump.
You cited China as the biggest threat to the United States. One aspect of that is their desire to expand their footprint and their control in the Pacific. What should the U.S. do? At what point should this country step up and say, that's far enough? How should we approach that?
Right. So right now we're going to have to do it economically. You know, I don't want to say like, and as a congressman, I don't want to say I disagree with taking anything off the table when we're talking about China. Like, and we saw this with Joe Biden the other day. Unfortunately, when you use certain wording in certain forums, I don't want to instigate a fight with China, but it is our largest existential threat. But it's our threat, not just economically, militarily, but also environmentally. As you know, like they've just been absolutely doing terrible things, you know, around the Philippines, the Galapagos, where they're overfishing. There's these giant fleets of boats going there, absolutely destroying the environment. Obviously, I've spoke about this in the past. My concern for the coral reefs, for the fish, and for the oceans, which is a huge, you know, huge concern of mine. But we have to go after them economically right now. So the first thing we need to do is bring back critical manufacturing, like the chips, like the pharmaceuticals, and to make sure that we have our food production here in the United States. The other thing too, is I'm very concerned about them owning our farms, but particularly like our food and meat processing plants. If somebody were ever to want to attack on the United States, you know, closing down these plants or spoiling them in some way. I mean, we saw what just happened with powdered infant formula, you know, where we put all of our eggs in one basket. I mean, it was 75, 80% of powdered infant formula at one factory. That's scary. And that's what's scarier to think is that the Chinese government could own a factory like that. And then we could end up with a skirmish with them, and they legitimately will be holding all of our baskets. We need to make sure that we diversify. We need to make sure that we protect ourselves. We need to make sure that our critical manufacturing is here. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. And some of it is requiring the federal government to make sure that our military weapons have US chips in them, to make sure that, you know, our Medicaid programs, when we're negotiating prices, that we're also looking at pharmaceuticals that are made in the United States. And then the other thing too is to help our allies and give them the resources to be able to fight back against the Chinese if they need to, and to fight against like things like these armada of ships that are absolutely out there destroying people's environments.
Well, you say they are our largest existential threat, but right now there's nuclear saber rattling on the part of Russia in Ukraine. Isn't that a significant threat as well?
Obviously, hey, listen, I'm never going to say nuclear weapons aren't a threat, but right now our largest threat is artificial intelligence, and the Chinese have been taking that from us. Artificial intelligence will allow them to shut down our entire country and control our nuclear arsenal if they end up with AI that they've been, quite frankly, stealing from us. Right now, a couple from who was working at Berkeley AI labs in California who went back to China under the guise of that their daughter was going to skate for them in the Olympics. They were really going back to steal our secrets and get the heck out of our country before they were arrested by the FBI. Now they're being investigated by the FBI, but we're never going to see them again. But when we're talking about artificial intelligence in China, you take every nuclear threat in the entire world and you put it into China's hands, because that's what it's going to be. When we talked about that pipeline that ended up being shut down by Russian hackers, put that on 100 times scale. Talk about our entire electric grids going down. And we've seen what happens when the electric grid goes down. You know, the most vulnerable out there of us will die, and there will be mass panic. And they'll be able to do this as a flip of a switch.
And now to you, Lori.
Thank you. Bob, you mentioned Russia, and I'd like to ask a question about that. So in terms of foreign policy, as you touched on, generally we have trading partners and we have strategic military allies. And much of Europe falls into both categories. How much should the United States do to keep Russia from annexing its neighbors? Not just Ukraine, but other bordering nations as well.
Well, especially when we start with Ukraine, let's start there. People would ask me about the bills that were happening over there. I don't think that we had enough oversight of the money and the weapons, where they were going and how they were being used. And that's problematic, number one. Number two, Europe needs to step up, and Europe never really steps up enough as they should. I mean, we've seen this ever since World War II. They don't seem to learn their lessons all the time. And I believe that they need to take the larger strategic role. It can't always be the United States. We can't be holding everybody's hands. Now, it's interesting. I'm always asked about Russia, but I'm never asked about MS-13 really that much, and the essentially narco-terrorists that are coming up here killing thousands of Americans. Now, how many Americans in the last year have been killed by Russians or ISIS or, et cetera, all of these threats that or the Chinese government? But, oh, sorry. I'll get you back. But, we see these huge threats and Americans being killed by South American narco-terrorists, but we barely even talk about it. I think that we need to spend a little bit more time worrying about our backyard, and quite frankly, what I believe is our biggest existential threat, China, which is quite frankly in our backyard. They're not only in our backyard, they're in our yard right now because they're buying our farmland, they're buying our meat processing plants. The Russians aren't doing that. The Europeans need to step up more. I'm all for committed to helping them, selling them weapons. We make great weapons here, as maybe Donald Trump would say. And I am all for supporting them in those measures. They are strategic allies. And again, as a politician, I never like to say that I'm going to take anything off the table. But we also need to say, hey, you guys really need to do it. We can't be sending our boots on the ground and everything like that. But hey, if Russia invades all of Europe, we'll see what happens then. But, they might not like our response. But again, I'm probably not going to be in the position to make those decisions for first strike level stuff. So it's probably not a good question for me.
Okay. I'd like to turn to immigration. And I noticed on your website, you mentioned securing the border with a physical barrier and technology. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, sure. I mean, we have all sorts of technology now with drones and everything else. I mean, we have, and quite frankly, using more artificial intelligence to monitor our border and making sure that people aren't getting through. A nation without borders isn't a nation. And let's face it, I know that 100% of our fentanyl and drug issues here isn't because of the border, but there is a lot coming through. And we do have a problem with narco-terrorists, especially groups like MS-13 coming up here, killing American citizens. Now, I've spent a lot of time in South America, particularly Mexico. It is just heart-wrenching the way that certain communities are terrorized by, coming out one day and finding, 50 headless bodies. I mean, we don't deal with that in the United States, but that's an issue that the United States has exported to South America because of this drug war. Because of course, let's face it, we're funding that drug war with our money buying drugs, and it needs to stop. So I believe in using a lot of measures to prevent and to de-escalate this drug war, to take out the narco-terrorists, to stop the fentanyl coming in. What was it, 100,000 dead Americans this year from opioid overdoses? I mean, this is a huge problem. I mean, we're going to lose more people in opioids over the last couple of years than we did in the Vietnam War.
When you mention a physical barrier, do you mean a wall?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Wall, drones, the Dynamics robot dogs. These things are cool, but they're scary.
Okay. So how should refugees fleeing violence, such as from the failing country of Venezuela, be treated at the southern border of the United States?
They should apply for refugee status before coming in. And quite frankly, I mean, Venezuela is something that needs to be taken care of as well.
Do you have any ideas on that?
No.
Okay. Well, we're a nation built on immigration, and millions are already here, and many of them are contributing to our economy and our society. And I'm thinking of children who might have been brought here illegally by parents crossing the borders. So, they consider themselves Americans. How do you feel about DACA? Do you have any? So, do you support anything about DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals?
I believe that I need to go in there with the strongest positions, possibly willing to negotiate. But the first thing that needs to happen is our border needs to be secured. Listen, my mom's an immigrant. Everybody's a child of immigrants. My great grandmother came here from Mexico. I feel bad for these kids, but by giving people status, asylum, looking the other way, creating this is what creates the drive for millions of people to come up here. And many of them are not refugees. They're just looking for a slightly better job. Many people, we've seen this, ditching their passports at the border because they're coming from countries like Brazil, which economically is doing pretty well. Quite frankly, Mexico compared to a lot of South America, especially when you look at something like a Belize, a Guatemala, Honduras. I mean, these are really terrible places. I've been to these places. I know how bad it can be for people there. But the solution can't be everybody moves to the United States and allow the narco terrorists to take over those countries. The solution is to take out the narco terrorists.
Okay.
And allow these people to take their countries back. I do actually want to make one more comment on this, because we do this as Americans. We call them Hispanics and Latinos. Most of them, you realize, are not Hispanic nor Latino in origin, right? And many of them don't even speak Spanish. They're indigenous people that are being pushed out of their countries by, quite frankly, colonizer narco terrorists who've taken over their countries and destroyed it, and now are pushing these people out of their native lands. That's not a good thing for them. And a lot of them don't want to do it. They want their own countries back.
Okay. Education, which you mentioned previously. You're for disbanding the Federal Department of Education, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you're also wanting to stop critical race theory. Can you give an example of critical race theory being taught now in New Hampshire schools that you'd like to see stopped?
Yeah, the banning and the canceling and redefinition and lies about Columbus Day. I mean, let's face it, we're celebrating 500 years of San Juan, Puerto Rico right now, the island and city that Christopher Columbus discovered, the hero of the island of Puerto Rico. And we try to absolutely just totally change all of Latin culture and history in this country. And that the fact that the first colonized city in the continental United States was St. Augustine, Florida, where, of course, Ponce de Leon brought the first slaves, not Virginia, as we're taught in history classes in the United States. Complete lies.
Okay. Should the federal government have a role? I'm thinking if you want to disband the Department of Education, then you probably think the federal government should not have a role in dictating curriculum choices to the
No, they
states.
shouldn't. Absolutely not.
Okay. All right. So how about standards? Do you feel we should have federal educational standards? Is it okay for
I believe states can come up with those standards themselves. I know a lot of Republicans out there give double speak on this one. Like they say, hey, we should get rid of the Department of Education, states' rights, but then let's talk about getting this Common Core CRT. Listen, as the federal government, I get rid of the Department of Education. I'm not going to push anything from the federal side. States can decide what they want to do. California wants to teach CRT all day long and Common Core math and transgender book rallies or whatever the heck they do out there. That's fine. But I don't want it in my state.
So as a nation, it's fine if kids in New Hampshire get a good education and kids in Mississippi don't get a good education because their state doesn't feel they should adhere to the same
Mississippi
standards?
would actually probably give a fine education compared to California. But that's
Okay,
not
then
what
use California.
That's not what the Department of Education does. Department of Education doesn't make sure that people get a good education. I mean, quite frankly, we've already seen the test scores. You bring up Mississippi, they're way down. So we have a Department of Education. So why are their test scores so low compared to New Hampshire and Massachusetts?
Well, but the question is, should there be some kind of national standard?
No, I don't believe that be a federal standard for this. I believe it's a states' rights issue. I believe that education should be by the states and it should be mostly local.
Okay.
And I do believe that, there are some things that people need to learn in certain communities more than other communities. We don't have an agrarial really culture here in New Hampshire, but you might learn a little bit more about farming, possibly in high schools in Idaho.
So what about standards to keep the U.S. from falling behind other countries in education?
Falling behind other countries?
Right.
How are we falling
Well,
behind?
probably, I think according to the Program for International Student Assessment, the U.S. is about at 13.
Interesting.
Based on tests of 15-year-olds in reading, math, and science.
Probably
China is at the top.
based on innovation, our corporations, and our ability to essentially create new products and run the world, I would say we're number one. I don't see any tech companies coming out of these supposedly number one countries. This isn't where
This is just based on test
Elon
scores.
Musk up there, because I was about to use that. That would have been a poor example, right? Although he did get most of his education over here in Canada, but that would have been one of the. I could have used Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg. Come on. How can you say that we're falling behind, that we're number 13, when basically, the brightest people, the most successful people are all coming out of one country, the United States, a little bit Canada.
Right. Well, that's specifically just based on test scores of 50.
Oh, I know. And I'm using specifically based on what we actually see out there in the business world and community. And quite frankly, even the academic world, medicine, most of these innovations are still coming out of the United States. It's amazing how well we're doing. We have the best colleges, MIT, obviously Keene State.
Yay. Okay. Can I turn to firearms?
Yes.
All right. You seem to be for expanding access to firearms rather than tightening controls. Would that be accurate to say?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So firearms are protected federally in the Constitution, and a lot of people do not have their constitutional rights to protect themselves when they travel this country. Some of my biggest concerns, I was talking to a truck driver the other day, and he was talking about, he's going to be, one of the things he might be trucking soon would be natural gas. And he says, that's essentially a bomb, but I can't arm myself to protect myself in my truck. I find that concerning. Another thing that we're seeing out there right now is this whole van life thing. People get in their van, they go across the country. We saw it with Gabby Petito. But you've got a lot of young people, particularly women, who essentially can't have the right to defend themselves because they're going from state to state, and they're going to go through a certain area that doesn't recognize the Constitution. And I believe that every American has the right to defend themselves with a firearm. And some Americans are not afforded that right.
Well, tens of thousands of Americans are killed each year with guns. I looked up CDC statistics, and their provisional data show that in 2021, 49,000 in this country were killed by guns.
Okay.
So is that just the price we pay for?
Well, let's start with that 49,000.
Right?
What percentage of that 49,000 was suicide?
I don't have that statistic, but I know it's a big part of
it's about half. Right off the bat, it's about half. Then you also have to look into that statistic. It actually adds in like a lot of criminals that were shot by police officers. Obviously people that we wouldn't be taking the guns away from. There are self-defense in there. I will admit there's definitely crime in there as well. But then let's start talking about what gun is killing the most people. What style of gun kills the most people in crimes?
I have a feeling you have the answer.
Handguns. But we don't talk about handguns anymore. We just talk about the vicious looking AR-15 and the AK-47s, right? So it's handguns. And where are the mass majority of these shootings happening? In the inner city. It's Baltimore, Chicago, Washington, D.C., liberal cities with extreme gun regulation. Tell you, it's not happening in New Hampshire. We're one of the states, no matter what metric you use, we've never had a mass shooting. Yet we have some of the loosest gun laws in the entire country. Us, Vermont, Northern Maine. I mean, I find it interesting when you look at it statistically, most of the places with the least amount of gun laws typically have the lowest crime.
Well, they're also the
So how
places
would you-
with the least population. I mean, so just in terms of the concentration of people interacting, you're going to have fewer opportunities for
Well,
that.
your statistic wouldn't apply very well to rural Mississippi or Louisiana.
So how would you advocate dealing with mass shootings?
So first off,
Such as
so
one in
I always
South.
hate to just say that we have a mental health issue in the United States. I can pinpoint to where a lot of that mental health is coming from. It's the internet, it's Facebook, it's TikTok, it's Instagram, it's the constant 24-hour news cycle after a mass shooting that continuously bombards us with a mass shooting. And then we actually have this tendency to see kind of copycat events happening. Children need to be taken off of the screens. We are rotting their brains quite literally. When you saw, so we just started looking at, I think, was it 30 years since that school shooting? I think it was 1992 or 90, I guess, yeah, it would have been 92, where the shooter blamed it on the movie, The Basketball Diaries. Do you remember this? This was like a kind of precursor to Columbine, where of course we started to talk about the movie. You're familiar with the movie, The Basketball Diaries, right? And then we talked about this during Columbine because they had the large trench coats and people thought that they were trying to mimic the characters in that movie, which is partially true, I think, but it's also, we've had violent books, violent movies in the past that didn't cause people to go shoot people. Obviously, other countries have this and they don't seem to have the same issues. But one of the things that we saw was I think it was the constant bombardment of that first shooting and then Columbine. And this is what is absolutely being programmed into children every day. They're seeing these images. They're becoming depressed because of the way that the internet works. People see all this money, they see these Instagram influencers, etc. They become depressed about their own lot in life because you always think the grass is greener on the other side. So I think that, and quite frankly, as a country, because I think other countries are a little better than this, our kids are getting way too much screen time, way too much bombarded with this. I think that the copycat aspect does come because it is happening in American cities. So it's Americans seeing it. There's a culture, there's a thought process. I think that there's also a problem with community, that we don't take care of each other as a community anymore. I think we are too lost into a digital world. And I think that that's where a lot of these health issues are coming from. I do believe that there's some issues with prescribing of medications. I think a lot of those kids really, really do need those medications. But I think a lot of people are being put on medications. And then it's like, you just give the kid the medication and then you don't care anymore. It's like, okay, I'll put you on something, or I'll put you on something new tomorrow, and I'll put you something new that. I don't think other countries are as bad when it comes to just overly prescribing all sorts of different medications, because we're all trying to find that pill that fixes you. So I think that we've got a lot of different aspects to look at in the mental health realm. Just saying that we have a mental health problem and leaving it at, as I've heard many people say, I think is a cop-out. I think we need to go after those specific reasons. And like I said, I think a lot of it's the digital media. Some of it's the pharmaceutical, although I do believe that some people really do need that pharmaceutical. So I think it's a mix, but that is something that I would like to look more into and talk about. And I think that we need to study more. And I don't understand why I live in a country now where where a person cannot get a cigarette until they're 21, but a 12-year-old can sit on their phone all day long, just pumping absolute trash into their brain while their brain is forming. I think that there needs to be more regulation when it comes to that. That's my personal feeling.
So Bob, if mental health is a big part of why we have more gun violence, are there solutions that you would back in terms of red flag laws or specific action that Congress might take to help with that interaction between the mentally ill or mentally unstable and gun ownership? Or
So I do want to clarify one thing. When we're still talking about the great amount of shootings out there, this is crime in liberal cities in Detroit and stuff like that. This is culture. That's not mental health. That's people part of, and that's the drug war that we see in South America as well. But when we're talking about these shootings, which quite frankly, as you and I both know, statistically are actually very small. I get it. It's when they happen, we spend a lot of time on the media focusing on it. It's all we want to talk about. And then, of course, you'll see from some Republican site that, 45 people were shot and killed in Chicago over the weekend. But we're going to focus on 8 kids in a school. And it's not tragic and terrible what happened to those 8 children in that school. But when we're really just talking about lowering gun crime, if that's what we want to really focus on, then we have to worried about the crime in the cities like Chicago, Baltimore, and DC. Now, if we want to talk about the school shootings, one of the things we do, and we don't need red flag laws. We actually ignore a lot of these children when they do the things that they're doing. Now, take Uvalde, Texas, for example, right? This child was arrested for making threats of shooting up a school. But then what did we do? As soon as he turned 18, we said, oh, it's fine. You're done with that. Now you can go buy a gun. But I also have to wonder sometimes, because I saw this situation in, I think it was Lee County, Florida, where they arrested, I think, like a 6-year-old for threatening to shoot up the school. Now, I wondered myself, is that kid, was he going to become a school shooter, or are we going to make him into a school shooter? Because I can only imagine that now he's going to go back to school and be ostracized for the rest of his life as being that kid who got arrested for claiming that he was going to shoot up the school, right? So I also have to wonder about how we take care of these kids like this Uvalde shooter. Was he a school shooter when he said he was going to shoot up the school at 14? Or was he put into the program at YDC? Was he, molested like the kids were here in New Hampshire at the Sununu Youth Detention Center? And did we make him into the school shooter? So I really do wonder about some of these youth programs where we're taking these kids in, and are we, it's the same kind of like circular logic of like somebody goes to prison or jail for a minor crime, and then they come out a lot worse. And we have to wonder, like, was that guy going in, was he really that bad? Was he a killer? Or did he go in for a minor crime and then we made him into a killer? So I think that's something that we need to focus on as well. So we need to focus on what people say when kids say things like they're going to shoot up a school. We have to take them seriously. But at the same time, I think we have to be careful. Is this just a 12, 13-year-old kid being an idiot because he saw something on TV and he thought it was funny? Or is this somebody who's really going to become a future school shooter? But at that point, that's not a red flag law, because that is against the law to begin with. If you're out there making credible threats, then something needs to be done about it. And we don't, because we hear time and time again that these people are making these credible threats and law enforcement just kind of ignored them. Or like the Uvalde, we arrested him. I don't know what happened to him in his time in custody with the police and the youth detention center that he went to. And I'd be very curious about that. Now, of course, as we know, most of those records are probably protected and we'll never see most of them. But that's what I'd be interested in. And I think that that's something, psychiatrists and psychologists and people far more qualified than me would be interested in.
Well, sure. But so as you pointed out, he turns 18, they let him out, and he goes and shoots up the school.
Well, yeah,
so
that's a problem.
So what should they have done at that point?
Oh, I mean, and now this was down to a state law thing.
Okay.
I don't believe, if some guy's in jail for claiming all these credible threats, and the day he turns 18, no, I don't think that you should just say, hey, let's forget that. I get it if it's like shoplifting and stuff, But I mean, like claiming to shoot up your school is a totally different level. I mean, that's a serious felony. This wasn't like a slight misdemeanor or I got caught drinking, drinking and driving or whatever. This is serious. And that's something that the states, I mean, it's up to the states to do it that way. I don't know if it would be best to all bring it all under the federal government. But I think the state really screwed up on that one. And they should not have just said, oh, you're 18, like all your past record goes away.
Okay. So we're kind of getting to the end of things,
Sure.
but we always want to give people a chance to, if there's anything we haven't covered, there's anything that you particularly wanted to say, what else should voters know about your candidacy?
Well, I mean, I think we covered a lot. I think one of the things that I like to say is that I think that we don't have a diverse Congress. And I don't mean by, race and gender and all that. I think it's diversification of background. And I think that I do bring a unique perspective, particularly when it comes to pharmaceutical manufacturing, which is something that affects all Americans, and also manufacturing, bring critical supply chain back. Also, my knowledge of computers and artificial intelligence. I know that's not on most voters' mind as their number one priorities, but quite frankly, it should be. I think having, a guy who's just not a lawyer and a lobbyist, and yeah, that was a kind of a direct hit at my opponent. I think we have enough lawyers and lobbyists in Congress. I think that we need people more with manufacturing and scientific backgrounds. We saw, the interviews, I think it was of Mark Zuckerberg, one of the congressmen famously brought in some like printed sheets and really didn't know what he was talking about. And we've seen a lot of congressmen not know what they're talking about when it comes to social media, search engines, the infringencies on our privacy by these big tech companies. I think it's important to have people there that really, truly understand them. And I think it's important to have an independent voter. And listen, I'm independent because you can see that, the corporate PACs and the pharmaceutical companies and all of them, they're not giving my campaign any money. I'm one of the guys that's kind of ignored. I really haven't been getting any support from either the Republican establishment or even like the Freedom Caucus. I am truly an independent voice. I know that people probably find me a little bit too different. I've been told that I'm a terrible candidate because I'm a straight shooter. I've also been told I'm a great candidate because I'm a straight shooter. I think, obviously, I think I'm probably, when it comes to a polished politician, I'm terrible. But I'm also, I believe, very honest about the things that I stand for. And I really don't run away from my beliefs. And you're not going to believe 100% with me on every issue. But I hope at least that people understand that I really do want to see what's best for this state and this country. And that I've got a lot of knowledge in a lot of different areas that people aren't talking about that we probably will be in 10 years.
Okay. Well, we certainly appreciate you taking the time to chat with us and let our readers know where you stand on things. And good luck in
Thank you.
November.
Appreciate it. Thank you.